by Mark Andreessen, the co-founder of Netscape. And he basically says software is eating up the world. And I think this also applies for the energy sector. And to kind of react to the huge implications of climate change, it's undergoing decarbonization and decentralization as well as digitalization, I believe. And I'd like to talk about one specific digital technology that has definitely been taking the world by storm lately and is also a big buzzword, which is blockchain. And blockchain basically is the underlying infrastructure of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And basically what it is a shared list, a digital shared list of transactions or a digital distributed ledger. And on each blockchain, you can have something called a digital wallet, which is basically like a node on a computer that you can use to create and send and receive transactions. And each time a transaction is sent and completed, it is stored in a time-stamped group of transactions in a list called a block. And as these transactions are increased, they're stored in an encrypted chain called a blockchain. I think what's so interesting about blockchain is that we can carry out transactions that would usually need a third party, which also usually takes a hefty chunk of the transaction fees. We can do these transactions without the need of this third party, because we instead rely on the encryption rather than a trusted intermediary. So this means that we can carry out even microtransactions very frequently and have the payment and the settlement at the same time. And this might have huge implications for energy. But what could this mean for energy? So say we have Anne and Bob, and they're both prosumers, meaning they both produce and consume electricity. And say Anne has some extra electricity, and Bob needs to buy some electricity. And say both Anne and Bob have something called a smart contract, which is basically a digital contract on the blockchain that can automatically carry out transactions for you based on predetermined conditions, like price ceilings or floors. Sorry. So say their smart contracts, agree. They can carry out this transaction, and this transaction, once completed, is encrypted and stored in a block on the blockchain. If we can scale this up, we can have more of a peer-to-peer or even, many-to-many energy sharing system that is more distributed and secure because of the encryption, as well as even have more of an energy democratization. Now, while this is all interesting in theory, we still need a lot more use cases and practical testing in real life, because energy is a very tricky area. So to begin to explore this is very initial research, so just to begin to explore challenges and opportunities moving forward with this, we did a case analysis of a blockchain-based electricity microgrid with peer-to-peer trading in Japan, not in Tokyo, but just outside of Tokyo. So basically, you can kind of see the scheme of the system here, but it includes 10 consumers, 5 prosumers, and 1 mall. And basically, the prosumers on the mall have a solar PV, and the prosumers have a lithium-ion battery. And all of these players are connected to a private Ethereum blockchain, or a private blockchain, and so what we call kind of an energy internet. And the prosumers are also connected via sub-power line, so they can do peer-to-peer trading among themselves on that line. So to begin to analyze this, we kind of are looking at these 5 dimensions. So technology, social, economical, environmental, and institutional dimension. Because we believe it requires a holistic approach to really understand how a new technology might affect the energy sector. So starting with technology, I think in terms of the challenges, the technical challenges of blockchain in this case is very much scalability. And with blockchain scalability, I mean throughput, or transactions per second, latency, or seconds per transaction, data storage. Basically, what's good about blockchain is that any transaction that is stored, the data that is stored in a blockchain is immutable, meaning we can't really delete it. This is good in terms of transparency and traceability, but not so good in terms of the long-term and large-scale data storage that we need. So this is a big issue moving forward if we're going to scale. and also cybersecurity. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about cryptocurrencies being stolen and cyber attacks here and there. So this is still an issue in blockchain. But what I think is so interesting about blockchain is that it's emerging. So there are new white papers coming out every day of how to tackle issues of scalability. So for example, one opportunity is sharding, which basically means database partitioning. So we take one blockchain, and instead of having all the transactions and all the activity on this one chain, we can divide it into several chains, thereby increasing the scalability of that network and having higher throughput and lower latency on each chain. But with sharding, we have the issue of cross-chain communication, which in turn might inhibit scalability. But there are a lot of new technologies coming out now that actually enable cross-chain communication, such as communication via smart contracts. And in terms of data storage, there's also several ways we can overcome this, such as off-chain storage, side-chain storage, as well as cloud storage. And in terms of cybersecurity, there are also several ways coming out that we can handle this, such as asymmetric encryption, zero-knowledge proofs, or pseudonymity, and so on. But I think what's also really interesting to me is that blockchain is interesting on its own, but I don't think it will be the one-size-fits-all solution for the energy industry. I think it's really important to think of a toolbox of technologies rather than focusing on one. For example, AI and machine learning, 5G connectivity, even quantum computing, which is likely to have been developed a lot more by 2050, some years ahead. For example, I think quantum resilience in blockchains would be important moving forward, because quantum computers might be used to hack into blockchains in the future. And especially considering the long-term kind of planning and investment processes in the energy sector, I think it would be important to start right now, like thinking about all these technologies and how they might come together. And all these technologies, I think, moving on to the economic dimension, are part of the information or digital revolution, which an author called Bimia in a book called The Blockchain Alternative says is basically reversing the Industrial Revolution and changing the structure of markets in this process. So this means, I think, we do not only need a technically decentralized system, we also need a decentralized market to enable this system. So challenges in Japan are related to quite low market competition. Japan has historically had many regional power monopolies, which still have a lot of power. There's also very high subsidy dependence among renewable energy still. And also there might be issues with contract interoperability between smart contracts and the future, like current more paper-based contracts. But there are more and more ways coming up, I think, that can be used to overcome these issues. For example, by 2020, the distribution and transmission markets in Japan will be unbundled. And also there are new wholesale markets being planned, such as balancing or capacity markets. Because in the future, who knows how the electricity market will look? Oh yeah, my focus is electricity, not energy in general. We might be selling and buying energy services on a more of an energy as a service platform. And I think if how we buy and sell and even invest in energy is changing, we also need to understand the behavioral and social aspect of that. So that brings me to the next slide, which is how will behavior and how will the social dimension be affected, perhaps, by blockchain in the energy sector? So with that, I'd like to ask you a question. What does a ballet performance and a good application have in common? Any ideas?
Have to be smooth.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I know it's a weird example, but I got this example from a book called Super Crunchers. Some of you might have read. Basically, the author explains that in a good ballet performance, you see the dancers on stage, and you enjoy the performance, which is quite short, but you don't really see the hard work and sweat and tears going on for years for these dancers to prepare for the performance, and you don't see what they're doing backstage. So similarly, in a good application, you see the front end, and you see the user value in what you get, but you don't see the super crunching or all the data processes going on in the back end. So I think similarly, for blockchain in general, including energy applications, sorry, there's a lack of user friendliness now because it's still developing. And we also don't really know how behavior might change and if the public will really accept this new way of trading energy. So I think moving forward, opportunities would be to really involve users and user testing more, and to really portray clear user value and develop user friendliness, such as via AI solutions. And then the social dimension as well, I think not only users, but also the overall stakeholder network that is involved in the energy sector would be important to manage in a better way, including both private and public sector players, as well as skill development of not only blockchain, but digital technologies at large. But I think there's a lot of also opportunities coming up to overcome this challenge. For example, in HR management, we can integrate digital tech more into energy companies, including blockchain, but also other technologies. And also, we can involve universities to a greater extent. For example, I saw that MIT actually has a lot of engagements already with blockchain and cryptocurrency initiatives. And also, we can have the energy sector and digital technology companies talking more and having more collaboration. So in terms of the environmental dimension, I think one of the key challenges is basically life cycle impacts of the grid equipment and tracking of that, as well as environmental metrics. Because as you can see, I think across the years, there's been a lot of fraud and scams connected to carbon credit schemes. But then inherently, for blockchain has the ability to enhance transparency and traceability in supply chains. So this can also contribute to tracking the supply chain of the grid equipment, as well as understanding and clearly tracking exactly how many emissions are being let out. And last, but definitely not least, is the institutional dimension. I think we found the most challenges here for the case, because basically in Japan, according to the Electricity Business Act and grid interconnection codes, a prosumer, or someone who both produce and consume electricity, would not really legally be allowed as an individual to trade on the wholesale market, because they would have to require a kind of retailer or supplier license. And this license is basically saying that they need to supply a stable amount of electricity to certain customers. But as a small-scale prosumer, I don't think this is very practical. So I think we need to develop more of a prosumer license. And then also, prosumers doing peer-to-peer trading would be doing that, based on our case, on low voltages. But the network consignment fee in Japan is higher for low voltages and lower for high voltages. So this would also be quite impractical, so that would need to be updated. But then also, I think the Smart Meter Measurement Act in Japan was developed in the beginning of the 1990s. So I think it's a little bit outdated and doesn't really integrate as much of all the digital technologies we have available today and all the advancements we've seen. But this Measurement Act will need to be developed, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in Japan, especially considering that, for example, in Tokyo, they have plans to cover the whole of Tokyo by 2020 with smart meters. And this is already being rolled out very quickly. And then in the whole of Japan, they're planning by 2023 or 2024, I can't remember exactly. But very, very soon, they're planning to have the whole of Japan connected in a smart meter infrastructure. So this offers huge opportunities for digital innovation, I think. And also considering that the government has really recognized the need of increased cybersecurity against cyber attacks, considering the rollout of IoT devices and smart meters, this might be a huge opportunity for blockchain and other kind of more secure technologies. But I think not only the actual regulation, but how we change regulation would be important to consider. And one interesting aspect I've found of this is the regulatory sandbox. Regulatory sandboxes were created initially for the fintech industry to be able to experiment in a safe space with the oversight of regulators, but with the regulatory slack for certain regulations. But I think this might be really relevant as well for the energy sector, to be able to bring the private and public sector players together to experiment together and enable more informed decision-making in both the private and public sectors. Because I think at large, based on our analysis and initial kind of thoughts, we would need more of an entrepreneurial and experimental approach moving forward in the energy sector. And that's put by famous author Scott Fitzgerald. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. So I know we can't just shut down all coal power today and switch to blockchain, but at least we can try to develop a pathway moving forward based on all these emerging technologies. So I don't think I can put it better than Fitzgerald, but my key takeaways basically are that blockchain has a lot of different kinds of opportunities for energy, but we need more of a coherent innovation management approach and a toolbox of technologies in a multi-stakeholder innovation ecosystem. So if you'd like to discuss more, please email me, and I can also introduce you to my colleagues, and if you have any questions, if we have time. I don't know.
So thanks, Amanda, for this very insightful we have quite a time for several questions.
So you talk about you have a consumer A and B, and they were exchanging electrons between them, so and they're paying each other through the coins. But how about as they transferring those electrons between A and B and the transmission line or distribution line? How they get compensated? So how do you envision the utilities' role in this?
That's a really good question. I think, if we take the really long-term view of this, I'm gonna get that slide. Hold on. If we get a really long-term view of this, I think the utilities would have a whole new kind of role in the energy sector. I've heard people say that they'll become more of a platform provider that takes a small percentage of all the energy sharing that goes on and handle maintenance and so on. They might be a service provider for certain things. So I agree, the grid use is one of the key issues we have to figure out if we're going to scale the case to begin with.
In the same lines, the role of the grid is central here. And so if I, for example, think of the conditions in Sweden, where we had the privatization of the grid, and now grid owners are increasing the price quite heavily. And with a situation like that, they become even more central. How do you see the interest of the governments in shifting to solutions like that?
That's really a good point. And I'm also Swedish, and I just realized that I went to the same university, or that you are at now. So I think, like I was talking about the grid consignment fee in Japan, it's an issue if we were to scale this up for the prosumers. So that's why right now we're doing it on a subgrid power line, so that it isn't as much of an issue and doesn't affect the grid as bad. But I think if we would scale up from the government perspective, I think the government is, on one end, wants to please the utilities and the large-scale power producers, but on the other end, they also need to manage all of the household solar PV and all the distributed energy resources that are coming up. So I think in terms of the second part of it, if we can find a way to make it the grid more of a platform for people to use rather than centralized as it has been, it might enable the government to please those distributed energy producers more. So I think it just depends which side we look at, in decentralized or centralized, perhaps. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, and I'd like to suggest that it would be quite interesting to explore in the context of developing countries and islands. For example, I work a lot with Indonesia, and most of the islands are not electrified. And this type of solutions perhaps could be quite interesting, because you have the electrification coming with certain groups in villages and so forth. And then you can actually create a system that could grow. And there is a lot of willingness to pay actually for energy in the developing world. And that would be a very interesting place where you don't have, we have already seen novelties in the developing world, because we don't have to build the system as we have built. And the system we have is not really to emulate, because we can do it so differently now.
Yeah, I agree. We've also been discussing doing some some study in developing countries that don't have grid access. So how can we use this to perhaps make more community energy platforms and so on? Because I think in developing worlds, for example, I did a thesis in Mozambique, and there a lot of people have cell phones, but they don't really have a way to charge their cell phones. But the fact that they have cell phones means they can use their cell phones, for example, to pay for electricity and perhaps even trade electricity. So I think it's a huge, both practical and research-wise, it's really interesting. I agree.
No, question I would have wanted to ask, is there any difference if we, for the implications of the blockchain and the sector, if there's difference between the energy based on the fossil fuel or the like renewable energy?
Essentially, no. It's just my opinion is just a digital infrastructure for tracking and to enable peer-to-peer trading. But I think because of that, it might be more valuable for distributed energy because, in essence, it's a distributed ledger, and it's meant to kind of enable decentralized networks. But I think even oil companies, some oil companies are using it to track their supply chain and to kind of manage supply chain management in general.
Do you have an estimate of like the cost of adding like this blockchain technology to the house? Like, is it just a smart meter, but you also have to have like computer power? Like, how much computer power and how much would that cost?
I think I guess it's two parts. One is the economic, one is the high power intensity that blockchain or Bitcoin is known for. In terms of the power intensity, it's been known for a high power intensity because Bitcoin originally is based on a consensus mechanism called proof of work. So basically, a transaction is validated based on a computer carrying out a complicated mathematical problem. And if it can do that, then it can carry out the transaction. But now there are new consensus mechanisms coming out, such as proof of stake, proof of authority, proof of identity, that don't base it on this mathematical algorithm being solved by a computer, but rather, for example, your identity on the blockchain or the amount of stake you have on the blockchain in terms of cryptocurrency. So in terms of the power intensity, my opinion is that it won't be as much of an issue, like especially even next year and especially not in 2050, which is that the theme of this event? Yeah, 2050. On the economic side, to install this to your house, I think you just need, let me see, where's my, so many slides. You need a digital grid, based on this case analysis, you need a digital grid controller, which can go into the smart meter, and a digital grid router. So this is, but to be honest, I'm not sure exactly how much it costs. And this is hopefully it can become more affordable after this pilot project. But yeah.
This is related to my research, and I was having problems with like a cost.
Yeah, because these houses are quite expensive in Japan. So I wouldn't say it's affordable for like, I couldn't afford it. So I think that's another issue because the people moving in here, we're not sure if like normal people would want to move here. Maybe the people moving are just interested in technology in general, like first movers. And these are more expensive houses than normal houses. So I think the cost is something we need to develop more as well. What's your research about?
It's how to size communities that are off-grid.
Oh, great. We should talk.
Okay, let's thank again for Amanda for the presentation and the webcam. So